going to be some history that you did not get in your classroom in school. The second part is going to be a little bit of the history of the Tuskegee Airmen, and then the last part will be Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Dart. This summer, my wife, Susan, who's in the back of the room, my critic, I know, I know that on the way home, if something goes awry, I'm going to hear it. So, but anyways, this summer, Susan and I had a fortunate trip to Williamsburg, Virginia, and Jamestown, and I learned that in 1619, the first slaves came to Virginia from Angola. And why am I starting there? Because our colonial period is now what I'm going to talk about. See, during the colonial period, if there was an uprising, an Indian uprising, the slaves were given guns to help protect the forts, the settlements, and the property. But those guns were taken back. We all know that Crispus Attucks was the first person reported killed just before the Revolutionary War began. In fact, it was a Tuesday, March 5th, 1770. And a group of men were throwing snowballs, of all things, at the British. The British fired their muskets, and Crispus Attucks died from his wound. Now, we go on to the Revolutionary War. General George Washington said in no way would the slaves or freemen be fighting for the colonial army. But John Murray, who was known as the Earl of Dunmore, Lord Dunmore, who was the governor of Virginia and also the governor of New York, Lord Dunmore said to the slaves and freemen, if you fight for the British, I will make you free. So what he did was form an Ethiopian brigade that fought for the British. And soon after the war, they were given back to their owners. Something else that I learned, though, when I was in Williamsburg, of all things, Lord Dunmore and General Washington were close friends. Even though their ideologies were different, they were very close friends. So now, we have slaves with guns, but after the war, they're taken back. Then we come to the Civil War with the 54th Regiment from Massachusetts. And let's take a little break here. From 1865 to 1877, we have a period of Reconstruction. From 1877 to 1964, we have the Jim Crow era. And I'll talk a little bit about that because that is really, to me, important. And before we go further, I don't want anyone, this is our history. So I'm not trying to talk about CTR, which you all have heard about, critical race theory, or white supremacy. This is our history. It's my history. It's your history. It's written in books, and maybe some people don't want to hear it, but it's already happened. During this period, we have a group of men known as the Buffalo Soldiers. No one is quite sure how they got the name Buffalo Soldiers. Was it because of their hair? Was it because they were fierce fighters? But the Buffalo Soldiers made up the 9th, 10th, 24th, and 25th regiments. And these men were sent west to protect property and property owners. There's a little story about the Buffalo Soldiers, though. During the Spanish-American War, they were the ones that captured San Juan Hill. Who gets credit for capturing San Juan Hill? Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah, okay. Teddy Roosevelt was on the hill next door. And he rode over and claimed that he captured San Juan Hill. I feel that's important because of this. In 1903, the Buffalo Soldiers were sent to Brownville, or to Fort Brown in Brownville, Texas. Again, they were sent there to help protect Brownville. But here's what happened. The people being so prejudiced in Brownville didn't want the Buffalo Soldiers there. So what did they do? They claimed that the Buffalo Soldiers of the 25th Regiment shot up storefronts, and they were the ones that killed a bartender. When it was investigated, they found that their horses had not been ridden, the rifles or pistols had not been fired, yet they were all put out of the Army. Theodore Roosevelt, being the President of the United States in 1906, was asked to review the case, and he let their dismissals stand. It wasn't until later on that Congress tried to give them all back pay, but by then, the Buffalo Soldiers, except for one living in a nursing home, was dead. In World War II, we had the Harlem Hellfighters. Just down the road, we have, in Albany, New York, a gentleman by the name of Henry Johnson, who distinguishes himself. President Obama finally gave him posthumously the Congressional Medal of Honor. I mentioned the Harlem Hellfighters because a letter was sent to France. The American government did not want the French fraternize with Negro soldiers. Okay, they said that, of course, they couldn't really stop the French, but they didn't want the French soldiers to fraternize with them. They wanted them kept separate. Remember now, we're in the period of Jim Crow. Separate but equal. Plessy versus Ferguson. A gentleman by the name of Eugene Bullard was an aviator, but he couldn't join for World War I. He couldn't join our Army Air Corps. He had to go to France to learn to fly. One of the reasons he went to France was he wanted to escape. the United States because his father was about to be lynched. So he went to France and became a pilot there. Now, here's what happened to him. And there's a great book on Eugene Bullard entitled All Blood Runs Red. And in that book, I learned that Eugene Bullard was sort of hounded by an American doctor who was white, who didn't think that the French should let him fly. In fact, the Germans had given Eugene Bullard the title of Black Swallow of Death because of his exploits fighting. We had other pilots, people, not military pilots, but people that learned to fly between 1920 and 30. There was Dr. Banning. For the ladies, there was a lady by the name of Willa Brown, Bessie Coleman. You don't want to leave the ladies out because they became great pilots. Bessie Coleman died in 1926, and they feel that when she was flying her plane, she forgot to strap her harness, and when she did a roll or a loop, she fell out of the plane. In 1939, you had Chauncey Spencer and Dale White, who did a trip from California. Well, actually, I'm sorry, it was from Harlem Field in Chicago to Washington, D.C. And they met a young senator. They were riding the tram between the houses. They met a young senator by the name of Harry Truman. Harry Truman, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but Harry Truman said that he would try to get Negroes into the Army Air Corps. All right, so, because I want to move along a little bit more. Now we're going to move into the Tuskegee Airmen. As you know, September 1st, 1939, the Germans invade Poland. But we had several people in the United States that did not want us to go into war, and that even happens today. In fact, there's a picture that I saw of Madison Square Garden with the American flag and the Nazi flag. And I was really surprised to find out that Charles Lindbergh was in that group of people that didn't want to go to war and was at that rally where the Nazi flag, you had the American flag and the Nazi flag in the same building. So, there were several newspapers in black churches that wanted to allow men to be part of the Army Air Corps. And they really pressed the government. Now, in 1940, President Roosevelt was going to run against a man by the name of Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie made a promise to the Negro population that if they voted for him, they would get Negroes into the Army, or he would get Negroes into the Army Air Corps. Well, Roosevelt got wind of this, and Roosevelt was running for his third term. He wanted to do Wendell Willkie one better. So here's what he did. He did three things. He asked his Secretary of War to make Judge Hasty a Howard University graduate and aide. And then, not only that, let's see. I want to get this man's name right. He promoted Benjamin Oliver Davis's father from colonel to general, and that made him the first black general in the Army. And then he also made Colonel Johnson a member of the Selective Service Board. And when the black newspapers and black churches and the NAACP saw all of this, they decided that maybe things were going to happen where Afro-Americans could get in the Army Air Corps. Now, let me explain to you why this was a good thing, hopefully. In 1925, the Army War College wrote a paper about Negroes. They said that Negroes were superstitious. They were cowardly, and they couldn't handle complex machinery. Now, those aren't the exact words, but that's basically what the paper said. And that's why I gave you some of the history in the beginning of where Negroes as slaves in the Army, the Buffalo Soldiers, the Hellfighters, here they have been fighting for this country. And now all of a sudden, because they wanted to join the Army Air Corps, they weren't qualified. In 1939, the CPTP, the Civilian Pilots Training Program, was also formed. And what that did was train our American boys to be pilots. Every HBCU had one of those programs. Historically black colleges and universities got that program. That becomes important because one of those programs was at Tuskegee before it became an Army airfield. Tuskegee, Alabama, was given us a CPTP program, and Moulton Field was built. They also hired a man by the name of Chief Anderson to be their chief instructor. And that's important because Chief Anderson is the one that gave Eleanor Roosevelt a ride. Now, why was Eleanor Roosevelt in Alabama, Tuskegee, of all places? Well, the reason that she was there was President Patterson was president of Tuskegee University, had invited a man by the name of Julius Rosenwald. And if you know your history, Julius Rosenwald was the head of Sears and Roebuck Company. He was an entrepreneur. And Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the trustees on that board. So Eleanor Roosevelt was there to attend a meeting. She asked to go for a ride at Tuskegee. Chief Anderson took her around in his Piper Cub. And a little funny story about that. The two Secret Service men that were with her didn't think she should go. Well, the younger chief, or the younger Secret Service man said to the older one, I think we ought to call the president and not let Eleanor go. Well, the older guy looked at him and said, when has the president ever been able to tell her to do anything? So she took a ride with Chief Anderson and went back to her husband and said, these boys can fly. So in 1940, Public Law 18 was passed. And that was to desegregate the armed forces. Well, still, they didn't want Negroes to fly. There was a lot of opposition in trying to form a Negro group. But in 1941, the first class was sent to Tuskegee, Alabama. There was a gentleman in that first class by the name of Benjamin Oliver Davis. And he had been teaching military science at Tuskegee. When he was at West Point, there's a long story about him being at West Point. He was the only Negro in his class. Nobody would talk to him, except the professors. When he got to class, you know, he could converse, but after class was over, he was in his dorm room by himself. He ate dinner by himself. He did everything by himself. He almost told his father he wanted to quit. But his father told him to stay. Thank goodness he did. Hopefully I didn't get too far off track here. So the first class of pilots, that is, and I'll back up a little bit. Oops, I hit something I shouldn't have. I'll back up a little bit. The Tuskegee Airmen, there were about 10,000 Tuskegee Airmen. And you have to understand, this was in a period of Jim Crow. So you needed mechanics to work on the planes, because you couldn't have a white mechanic work on your plane. You needed doctors, nurses, you needed people to be in the PX, you needed cooks. Everything was separate but equal. There were 996 men trained as pilots. 451 of them went overseas to fight as pilots. But again, you need, like I said, you needed quartermasters. In fact, General Marshall and his staff, and these men proved him wrong, said it would take 10 years to train a line chief, 3 years to train a crew chief, and 2 years to train a hangar chief. And these are people that service the planes, get them ready to go out. Well, Tuskegee Airmen proved them wrong. It did take 9 months, though, to train a pilot. And when I talk about my dad, I'll talk a little bit about those 9 months. The first commander of Moulton Field and was a man by the name of Colonel Ellison. And then the Army, because the runway was so short at Moulton Field, and it was more of a civilian pilot center, they built Tuskegee Army Airfield, which was about 10 miles away. Primary training was done at Moulton Field, and then the basic and advanced training moved to Tuskegee Army Airfield. In the first class, there were 13 members. What's interesting about that is the percentages that were given for Negro pilots and Negro officers was the same percentage that was given to their white counterparts. So in the first class, there were 13 men to be trained as pilots. Guess what? Only 8 of them made it through. One of them, luckily, I'll say again, was B.O. Javis, and another man by the name of George Roberts. I used to know all of them, but over time, old age, I guess, you forget. Again, the first commander of the base was Ellison, and Ellison was an interesting character. He sort of tried to relax some of the Jim Crow rules. Well, the Army got wind of that, and they moved him to another base. The next man was a man by the name of Colonel Van Kamp. He was a stickler. He told the pilots or any of the officers that were Negroes that they were not to go to the officers' club. If you weren't white, you weren't getting in. And yet, they were second lieutenants. They were already officers. They couldn't get in. The last person, there were others, but I say the last because this gentleman was the commander when my dad got to Tuskegee. He was a man by the name of Noel Parrish. And Noel Parrish was the son of a minister, and he knew the South very well, being from Kentucky. What Noel Parrish did was relax the rules again, and he told the white officers that if you didn't want to eat lunch with the Negro officers in the PX, you can go and eat in your cars. A little story about Noel Parrish. One night, a Negro officer was in Tuskegee, the town of Tuskegee, Alabama. And a police officer went to arrest him because he thought he was drunk. Well, a Negro MP happened to see what was going on, and he drew his gun and said, "You're not going to arrest him," and took him away. While the townspeople and the police officer beat up the both of them pretty bad. Well, word got back. Take a little drink here. Word got back to the base. The Negroes loaded up a truck, 2 trucks with rifles and pistols, and they were going to go into town and get the MP and the officer back. Noel Parrish stopped them, thank goodness, because there might have been a race riot if they had gotten off the base. Noel Parrish stopped them and went into town and smoothed things over. But I will say that that didn't happen while my dad was there. This happened before Clarence arrived. And then from the Tuskegee airfield, the Tuskegee Army Air Base, they were sent to a place called Selfridge Field for overseas training. And then the 99th, which was the first fighter group, was shipped to Europe. The interesting thing about that was this. You couldn't tell your wife or girlfriend where you were. And they landed in Oran, Morocco. So there was a great movie back in the 1940s. And some of you older people like me might know the movie. But when they wrote home to tell their wives and girlfriends where they wrote back and said they were at Rick's place. Casablanca, yeah. So they would write back and say, we were at Rick's place. People would understand and know where they were. So that's basically the Tuskegee Airmen. I know I've left a lot of their history out. Well, Warren, better talk. Okay, the next part is Clarence Dart. Clarence Dart was born in Elmira, New York, December 6th, 1920. He went to the Elmira schools. And to me, when he was born, well, I kind of like it because it's really a part of history. The Wright brothers took their first flight in 1913. Oh, shoot. There's one. That's bad. This is Clarence in his graduation picture as a second lieutenant. But anyways, Clarence was born in 1920, 17 years after the Wright brothers took their first flight at Kill Devil Hill. Again, he went to the Elmira schools. He loved building model airplanes. And I think like most kids his age, and I think it was because at that time planes didn't fly as high as they did now. The kids were interested in flying. So really, when he joined the Army Air Corps, really what he really wanted to do was really not fight a war. He wanted to learn to fly, something that other people didn't do. After high school, my dad didn't go to college because my grandparents couldn't afford to send him to college. My grandfather worked on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and my grandmother was what you would call a domestic. She cleaned houses, did seamstress work. And so they didn't, and plus, well, what happened between 1920 and about 1939? The Great Depression. So there wasn't a lot of money. My dad talks about selling apples, collecting cans and bottles, just to get money to go to the movies. So he didn't go to college, but he did go to Elmira's Aviation Ground School, where he learned airplane mechanics, and then he worked on airplane radios. In the summertime, he worked at Harris Field. Some of you may know Harris Field as the glider capital of the world. And so, but he never got an airplane ride in doing all of that. It wasn't until, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, until he got into the Army. When my dad turned 21, which was December 6th, 1941, it was the day before Pearl Harbor. But on that Sunday, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, he was with his grandmother singing in the church choir at a radio station. He and a friend went home and they told their mothers they were going to join the Navy. Well, my grandmother said, "You're not joining any man's Navy, Army, or anything. You're home." Well, a few weeks later, the Army Air Corps comes to town and starts giving tests. Well, he passed all the tests but the eye test. And he says that the reason he failed the eye test was the night before he was so excited about getting a chance to go into the Army Air Corps that he stayed up all night. And they had this rudiment test with two sticks that you had to try to line up to do depth perception. Well, he failed the test. And they told him, since he had passed all the other tests, that they would be back in about 8 months and he could retake the test. They came back, he passed the test, and he was waiting to be sent to Tuskegee. Well, that didn't happen right away because Uncle Sam wrote him a letter and he got drafted. So he was sent to Fort Niagara. And at Fort Niagara, they gave him a questionnaire asking him the things that he would like to do. Well, he put down that, he'd trained, worked on airplanes, knew about radios, so he wanted to fly. Well, and he also told them that the Army Air Corps had said that he was going to be able to fly, and they were going to send him to Tuskegee. Well, they didn't listen to him. Next thing he knows, he's at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. And my dad was really good at mathematics, so he was put on the artillery range, and there was a stick or a lining scope on the gun. And my dad, being good at math, could figure out the triangulation, and his group kept hitting the target. Well, his commanding officer liked what he did, said, "Clarence, we're going to make you a second lieutenant." Well, my dad said, turn that down, because he figured he knew what would happen to second lieutenants. They were sent out forward of the artillery, and he said, "I'm not going to get shot." So he turned them down. And when it was his turn to guard the post, he did something that is a no-no in the military. He sent a letter off to Washington, D.C., telling him what was going on. Well, Washington, being smarter than my father, didn't send him back a letter. They sent a letter to my grandfather, telling my grandfather, "Tell Clarence not to worry. We know where he is, and when his class is coming up, we'll get him." Well, the letter did come, and they were at liberty on the base. And it wasn't until nighttime that the commanding officer said, "You're going to Tuskegee." And the train was leaving within 2 or 3 hours. So he had some friends, and they put him on a supply truck, and he made it to Tuskegee. This is my dad in his flight jacket. Just a brief story about that flight jacket. I believe this is his 65th birthday. And what I did was, I was teaching at Greenfield Elementary School. The lining in the jacket was ripped in several places. But I had a friend, Kathy Parker, whose husband worked in Amsterdam at one of the leather factories. So I asked Kathy if her husband could put a new lining in the jacket. Well, at first, when the gentleman saw the jacket, he didn't want to touch it, and neither did his employees. But finally, they said, "Yeah, we can put a new lining in it," and they were very careful. In fact, I still have the jacket, and they put a new liner in, and I gave it to him for his birthday. So that's my dad in his flight jacket with the Flying Panther of the 99th, which is the oldest of the Tuskegee Airmen. We can go to the next one, Michelle. Moulton Field has now been turned into a national park. In fact, it's an operating airport now. It was given back to Tuskegee. But like I said, this is where my dad first started. We can go to the next. This is the first plane that my dad flew. This is known as a PT-17. It's known as, I'll ask you a couple questions because I like to do this with kids. So what do you think the PT stands for? Primary training. Yeah, this is known, most people don't know this, but this is known as the Stearman Cadet, KDET, K-A-Y-D-E-T. This is the first plane that they got to fly. Now, my dad had never been in a plane. So the instructor takes him up, and they're flying around. My dad's having a great time. The instructor says, "Clarence, take us back to the field." Or no, sorry, I told that question wrong. "Clarence, do you know where the field is?" Clarence, being a wise guy, goes, "Yeah, it's over there." Instructor takes the plane, tips it up our end, and goes. And I tell that story because my dad decided he would never get lost. I had a friend, and one of my friends is sitting in the front row. We used to go to Oshkosh a lot. Well, one year, the group, they had it planned. I believe it was every 2 years they would go. But my friend Brian Sherman got his pilot's license, and we decided that we were going to go to Oshkosh. And Brian and I asked my dad if he'd like to go along, so we took my dad with us. Well, as we were flying west, go to Rochester, the winds were sort of pushing us off course. The next thing I know, I looked at Brian and I go, "Brian, we're over the Finger Lakes." Brian looks back and he goes, "Yeah, now what do we do?" My father taps me on the shoulder and says, "Give me the charts." So I handed him the chart. "Oh, Clarence, I'll never get lost again." Put us right back on the chart, or right back on course, and we went to Rochester. Go ahead, Michelle. This is known, its nickname is the vibrator, but this is a BT-13. We go from primary or basic, or Yeah, primary training to basic training. What that meant was, this was a little more complicated. The propeller could be shifted. If you know about constant speed props and that kind of stuff, you can change the prop in this plane. You also learned instrument flying. Well, that's great. Till one day, my dad's doing instrument flying, nothing's going right. He talks about the pilot being a little shorter than him, but anyways, they're flying around, and my dad said he can't get anything to go right. Because instrument flying is like, to him, flying with a blindfold on. Well, when they got back to the field, landed the plane, you're supposed to salute the instructor, go in for a briefing. My father said he climbed out of the plane and he said, "This is what you can do with your..." And he said he was in tears. He thought he had washed out. So he went back to his room and began to pack. And when he walked out, his name was still up on the board. So he went back and he did a better job after that. This is known as the AT-6 or the Texan. A little more complicated, had retractable landing gear. And this is where he finally gets his rating, and then he's sent to Selfridge Field for overseas training. This is the last document before going overseas that he got, that he was instrument rated. He talks about flying up to Ocala, Michigan, from Selfridge Field in snowstorms and all kinds of training like that. And this is just before, I think the date's on there, just before he goes overseas. They said the trip overseas took 9 days. 2 of those days were spent in a storm. He said the pottery and the crockery was falling off the shelves. The tables were rolling all over. He said the men were getting sick on board, but then they finally rode out. And again, he landed in Oran, Morocco. When they were flying and fighting, doing strafing missions in Italy, you can go to the next one. This is the first plane that my dad flew. It's known as a P-40. And the P stands for pursuit. Yes, they weren't called fighters yet, because you were going to pursue the enemy. And the plane that he got, there were several models of the P-40. The last P-40 he got was P-40N, a little bit lighter and a little bit faster. 50 caliber machine guns, and they could carry bombs, but not more than, I think it was 500 pounds. He flew strafing missions in this. In this plane, he was shot down twice. And yeah, he survived because I'm here. On a strafing mission, the first time he was shot down was March 24th, 1944. And here's what happened. The flight leader put them in what's known as in trail, one behind the other. And they were supposed to relieve a bunch of GIs that were pinned down by machine gun fire. So he puts them in trail, and they go down and they do some strafing, but no shots came back. Well, they go around a second time, do the same thing. My father said that he thought this guy was nuts. He said they were told that if you went by the first time and didn't get any gunfire, you go back and you do it the second day. You don't go back the same day. Well, they went back twice. The third time, he said it was just like the 4th of July, because I think it's every other bullet has a tracer. And all of a sudden, they start coming up, they're flying over the canopy, and he said they're flying down. The next thing he knows, he has a hole in his cockpit. Fluid is going all over. Then he looks outside, there's flames, and he winds up finding a road, and he belly lands on the road. He said the tail came off, the engine comes out of its mouth, the wings come off, and you were supposed to pull your canopy back, put it in D10. Well, for some reason, the canopy came out of the D10, went forward, and he got shut in the plane. So he said he popped his harness, and then he put his feet up, and he said somehow God must have been with him, because he was able to push the canopy up and get out. And the men took him back to his base. Now that's the first time. That was March 24th, 1944. And I say that because on March 27th, 1944, he gets a medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, for heroism. I have not yet been able to figure out what he did, because his records were stored in Denver, Colorado. So I've written them, but since the records have been destroyed, I never knew what heroic thing he did to earn that Distinguished Flying Cross. The second time he got shot down was when they were flying over Anzio Beach, and the Germans had these guns that were on tracks that would come out and bomb the ships in the harbor. Most of the time they did it at night. He said the gun's name was Anzio Annie that they were trying to get. And he tried to skip a bomb into the tunnel to get the gun because they weren't out. Well, in doing so, again, he gets shot, and this time, still in a P-40. He says he loves that plane. He winds up crash landing again, but he said, you know, they're calling on the radio, Clarence, bail out, bail out, bail out. But unlike our fighters today, he said the way to get out of a P-40 is to roll it and drop out. Well, he was too low. He was only up about 2,000 feet. He figured by the time he rolled and dropped out, his feet were going to touch the ground. So he rode the plane all the way down. Again, this time, this plane cartwheeled. He was going to put it in some saplings, but the English, the British Army, had what were known as long toms in the saplings, and so he didn't want to land on top of them, and he didn't want to release the bombs on them, so He didn't arm the bombs, but he did release them. And he said he must have scared the hell out of them. And then he landed in a field, and he said he was banged up for a few days. But then he went back flying. When he flew this P-40, he was with the 12th Air Force. He flew 45 missions with the 12th Air Force. Next plane. This is a P-51. This is either the B or the C. You couldn't really tell the difference between the B and the C unless you knew where it was built. The Bs were built in Texas, and the C was built in California. The D model, which people know with the bubble canopy, is probably the more famous, but my dad didn't like it. He thought that the C was faster. The bubble canopy had gave it more weight, and plus being, I almost want to call him Chicken Clarence, he felt by sitting up high with that canopy around him, the Germans could see you. And I'm thinking, Dad, what difference does it make? I mean, you're still being fired at whether you're in a C or a D. But he felt that he was more exposed in the D model. He flew 50 missions with the 15th Air Force. And this is interesting because there was a General Mollmeyer that didn't think that the Tuskegee Airmen were doing their jobs very well. So he sent a report back to Washington. And this is where my dad's commander changed from B.O. Davis to a man by the name of Roberts and then Campbell. But B.O. Davis went back to Washington, didn't lose his cool, but told Congress what the Tuskegee Airmen, of course they weren't known as the Tuskegee Airmen, but what the 332nd Fighter Group had been doing. And General Marshall then asked B.O. Davis if he could protect the bombers. See, here's what happened. A lot of times, the bombers were taken to the IP, the initial point, and then the bombers would go off by themselves, bomb their targets, and come back. And the fighters, in the beginning, when the Germans came up, go off and fight Germans. In fact, there were probably more white aces than there were Negro aces. And here's why. B.O. Davis told the Tuskegee Airmen, or the 332nd, that if you go off chasing Germans for kills, you were going to be court-martialed. Your job was to protect the fighters, or protect the bombers. In fact, B.O. Davis renamed his plane by request. And the reason that he renamed his plane by request was because when the bomber groups realized they weren't losing many bombers, they wanted the Tuskegee Airmen to protect them. Think about this. In a bomber, you have between 10 to 12 men. If the bomber gets shot down, think of the lives that are lost. Just take a number like 12 and multiply it by 10. And then you have hundreds of bombers going on these raids. We are fortunate, our family is fortunate enough to know a gentleman by the name of Earl Martin, who was a prisoner of war, who was a pilot, 17. And he always told my dad, if we had had the Tuskegee Airmen, we would have probably survived. Well, again, we're 5 minutes over. Okay. I'll just jump right to the honors that my dad had. My dad, like I said, he got a Distinguished Flying Cross, a 4 Oak Leaf Cluster, Purple Heart, Air Medal, Bronze Medal, 4 Defense Medals, World War II Victory Medal, and the New York State Capricious Medal. After the war, my dad went to work for General Electric, married Millie Dart, had 8 kids, worked for General Electric for 38 years, worked at the main plant. He says that his favorite job was working for Flight Test, which is now the East Sam Museum. He also worked at Capel, Most Atomic Power Laboratory, and often talked to a gentleman by the name of Admiral Rickover. I think my personal feeling is because my dad stayed at General Electric for so long, especially at Capel, his engineer buddies got him to stay a little bit longer than what he wanted. I think, I'll never be able to prove this because my dad, if they said that what you're doing is top secret, you couldn't get anything out of him. I remember we used to have to bring home these federal impact statements, and you were supposed to fill it out because the school district would get money for those people that work for the federal government. And you had to tell your job. My dad, I remember being in tears one night. I handed him the paper and he said, "I'm not filling that out." He said, "If the school district wants to know what I do, have them call me." So the reason I tell that story is there was a submarine class known as the Sea Wolf just before he retired. I think that my dad, being a designing draftsman, helped design the reactor for that Sea Wolf. And the number of times he went to talk to Admiral Rickover, I feel that they had built up a relationship with Rickover and the engineers at General Electric. That was the reason that he stayed. And then last but not least, he was president several times for the Saratoga Springs Salvation Army, and he served as president of the board for the Charlton School for Girls. Now, I told Michelle, this is a wonderful building. The information that I gave you, you're welcome to check it out. On YouTube, Clarence W. Dart is still giving a veterans talk on YouTube. Susan and I watched it yesterday. I have a friend who's now retired also by the name of Matthew Roselle. And he has a series of 8 books, The Things Our Fathers Saw. There are a wonderful history of World War II and the Korean and Vietnam War. If our library doesn't have them, I hope they get it. Or, get the 8 books. Another great DVD is Silver Wings and the Civil Rights. These men were forerunners of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1947, Truman desegregated the armed forces, and also during that year, the Army Air Force changed to just the United States Air Force. Oh, there's one more picture that we'll show. This is Clarence sitting in a P-51. I like to show this picture because the next picture Almost the same. That's taken at Oshkosh. Their a plane has been restored, P-51C, just like the one he flew during the war, also named the Tuskegee Airman, owned by the CAF, the Commemorative Air Force. And that's going to be the end of my talk, because I could talk all day. But